To stand back for a moment over the last 12 months, it's been, particularly here where we are in Australia, because we're very, very aware of the tensions to the north. They're very much in our minds, and the prospect of conflict over Taiwan in particular. So you add that as a sort of great black cloud hanging over the other issues of the last 12 months. If I could ask you generally, I mean, you think of it, you've had the impeachment trials over the last 12 months. You've had the relentless media onslaught for and against Trump. You had then the Black Lives Matter protests, the November elections, the January 6th storming of Capitol Hill. While all that was going on, of course, there was the horrors of COVID. What general observations would you make about the way in which the American media shed light on what was happening and reflected back to the people reliable information with which they could create an informed view of what was happening?
Yeah, I think every single one of the issues that you just brought up, including COVID, I think what distinguishes all of them is that they've been presented to the public as essentially binary issues where there's one side and another side. So if you turn on Fox News, you're going to get one version of the story. And if you turn on CNN or MSNBC, you're going to get another version of the story. It's more or less predetermined. And they do that with every issue, whether it's a partisan issue or not. I think what was extraordinary about the way we covered COVID is we managed somehow to make even that into a partisan issue. So when it first broke, there was a stress on any factoid that made the crisis look worse. That tended to be highlighted in the kind of anti-Trump media. And then there was anything that suggested that there might be a cure or relief or progress that was highlighted in the Fox media. A great example of this was the debate over hydroxychloroquine, which was just a medicine. It doesn't have any political value one way or the other, but just because Trump said something positive about it once, anything that was negative about hydroxychloroquine, that appeared in the New York Times, CNN, and then the opposite thing happened in Fox, which is, again, I don't think it's the right way to cover the news. The journalists should be taking in all sides of the issues, and usually they're not binary. Usually they're multi-shaded, and they have many gradations of different realities involved. And I think you're presenting a false face to the public if you only show them two sides of every story.
So the interesting thing here, Matt, is that the position you're taking is one of defending professionalism, and you're actually standing against this partisanship that's entered the media now, where in this country, probably the most senior journalist said to me on one of these talks recently that you've actually got to do a sort of a political analysis of each of the media sources in the country and then try and pick two or three of them so that you can keep yourself informed and form a middle ground. And that's the great tragedy of it. What you're really arguing for is a return to simple professionalism, it seems to me.
Yeah, and what you're describing, it's interesting. When I lived in Russia in the 90s and during the Yeltsin years, each one of the newspapers was essentially owned by an oligarchical business figure or a mafia-linked figure, and they all had their own takes on the news. And in the morning, when you wanted to figure out what happened in the world, you had to kind of sift out, well, this person wants to say this and that person wants to say that. Somewhere in the middle of all of that is reality, but you would never see it all presented in one place. Unfortunately, that's kind of how we have to do things in America now, and I'm guessing that you're saying it's the same thing in Australia too. You have to kind of pick and choose the factoids that you see in the different media outlets, and from that construct, a sort of basic framework of what's actually happening. And I just don't think that's our role. I think when we're doing the job correctly, journalism is kind of separate from politics. We're not aligned with any one particular party, and we have to be that. We have to be perceived as that also in order to be believed and trusted and seen as a check on power. If we're seen as being aligned with the Democrats or the Republicans, then what good are we, right? I mean, I think that's the problem as far as audiences are concerned. They might as well just read a press release from the DNC or the RNC, the Republican and Democratic committees. Why bother going to a news outlet if they're going to do that? So yeah, you're right. It is basically I'm saying I think we need, in order to get our credibility back, we have to go back to the kind of the basic professional attitude towards the job.
Yeah, to tease this out a little bit, you've spoken about what you call a schism in journalism between those who are seeing journalism as a fact-finding project largely detached from ideology on the one hand, and a new school, your words again, which sees its project in terms of, interesting term you've used here, moral clarity. What do you mean by this term, moral clarity, and how much of a problem has it become? It ought to be a good thing, but I think you're describing something troubling.
So this is a term that was used by a prominent journalist in this country, Wesley Lowery, who was arguing that the old school, detached, what they call the objective style of journalism, that kind of neutral third-person tone that the anchorman used to read on the air, that was separate from politics, that view from what he called the view from nowhere form of journalism was no longer legitimate, and that in order to properly do the job, we had to have quote unquote moral clarity, which meant being open with audiences about where we stand, where our biases are, what our political beliefs are, and acting accordingly. Now, to some degree, I agree with him. Like I'm a big fan of journalists like Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson. There's a famous story about Thompson on the campaign trail that when he came home from covering the campaigns, he was the only reporter who didn't have to tell his or her spouse what it was really like out there because they'd already read his articles and they knew what he actually thought. I think that's very valuable. I think you have to. It's important to be honest with your readers about what you think. Sometimes in some formats, the problem is that you can't just throw your lot in with one party or another. You never really know who the villain in any story is going to be. Sometimes the facts cut differently than you expect. Technically, when we're doing this job, we have to clear our minds each time we do an assignment and assume, relearn all the facts from zero as we cover each story, because again, you just never know how things are going to break. With that kind of moral clarity approach, you're picking ahead of time what your stance on things is going to be, and I think that boxes you in. It makes it difficult to cover. Just to quickly with the example of Donald Trump, you can be very much against Donald Trump. You may not like him very much, but it's very important to examine why people voted for him, right? So you have to actually go in there and say, well, the people were responding to this and that and this, and he said this thing that might have been true or in the ballpark of true. If you don't do that, if you cover those things up because you're trying to push an anti-Trump line, you're deceiving your audience. You're not telling them the truth. And I just don't think that works.
Well, I would suggest the irony of it is that it makes the very problem you say you are trying to overcome.
Exactly.
Call it Trumpism. You actually make it worse.
Mm-hmm.
It's self-defeating. You're making the very problem that you are describing as catastrophic more catastrophic, if I can use some sloppy language.
Absolutely, and you're validating every criticism that he makes. If Trump gets up there and, by the middle of his presidency, a bulk of his speeches were about how they're lying to you. They're elitists. They're all in it together. CNN and the collapsing New York Times. They're all, he would describe this as sort of a conspiratorial oven against Trump and against the ordinary person. And so when we get up there and we misstate things, we present things in a slanted way, it just confirms all those criticisms and makes it very, very difficult to reach people. I think, when you have a figure like Trump, you actually have to be bend over backwards to avoid having that happen. It's challenging, but I think it's really necessary.
To what extent are your insights, or have your insights been built up and accelerated by the time you spent in Russia as a young man? Because as we look on that was an age when ideology was incredibly powerful. Propaganda and the use of the media, you've touched on that, was extraordinarily prevalent. And yet the whole thing collapsed because in the end, no one believed it.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it was very influential. There were a lot of analogs to what happened in the 90s to things that subsequently happened in the United States. The The financial crisis in 2008, which I also covered, had a lot in common with a lot of Russian corruption schemes. And then the rise of Putin, he's obviously almost an exactly opposite character to Trump, personality-wise. He's a self-made figure. You know, Trump was the scion of inherited wealth, but Putin was popular in Russia for some of the same reasons that Trump was achieved popularity in the United States. The performance of the Yeltsin administration was terrible. There was widespread economic distress in the country. People had suffered an incredible loss of trust in institutions generally, not just the government, but in all institutions. And Trump capitalized on some of the same things. He went after every institution in America, you know, from NATO to the news media. I guess NATO is not an American institution, but aligned with the United States. He went after all of them, and he basically said, you know, there's this rot in our society. They're ignoring you. That was very similar to what happened in Russia in the 90s. The people, they had negative feelings about what was going on politically in Russia, but they also were in such distress that they were willing to try anything. And that was very similar. So I think that had a lot of influence on my thinking.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.